So one thing, Pat, I'm in my office building, and I certainly
Yeah,
hope that cleaners show up around here.
me
Usually
too.
come early.
We'll get into it. We'll have them taken out. Just kidding.
Okay.
We are certainly live. This is a Livestream Hangout with me, Patrick Coffin, host of the Patrick Coffin Show, which drops all over the galaxy, especially the interwebs, every early Tuesday morning. I also co-founded with my good wife, Coffin Nation, the largest culture restoring community in the world. If you're interested to contribute to that and join and find out what it's all about, the website is coffinnation.com. As folks roll in Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, I want to just mention that our topic is extremely important and subject to a lot of misunderstanding. It's the topic of anger and forgiveness. People say anger is a mortal sin. It's one of the 7 deadly sins. On the other hand, our Lord and Savior was certainly angry at the injustices and the evils perpetrated by the people, money sellers, money changers in the temple. So what are we supposed to believe about anger? Is anger always sinful? Is it always morally neutral? Also, forgiveness. Are you supposed to ask for forgiveness before someone can extend it to you? Or is forgiveness something that's a choice irrespective of the repentance of the other person? All this and more is the subject of a fine new book by my longtime guest and friend, Dr. Richard Fitzgibbons. It's called Habits for a Healthy Marriage, a handbook for Catholic couples. By the way, I'm just flashing the title here to the camera. This applies to other Christian couples, anyone who thinks that marriage is indissoluble, anyone who wants to work on their broken marriage rather than just discard it and move on to better spouse number 2 will enjoy the next session. It's got an endorsement by Archbishop Sam Aquila of the Archdiocese of Denver. And with that, I bring in the man himself, Dr. Rick Fitzgibbons. Hey, Rick, thanks for coming on.
Hey, Patrick, thank you for inviting me.
It's a difficult topic. And before we get into it, I want to mention you and Dr. Robert Enright have devoted decades to the clinical benefits of forgiveness and generosity as a way of overcoming, bitter root judgments and grudges and so on. Let me ask you off the top, how did you stumble into this key insight of the centrality of forgiveness for your patients?
So that's a very good question. That's a very, very good question. And I think the way I came upon it was actually not my mental health training, but during my training in psychiatry, I went to a charismatic meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And the focus of this very simple redemptorist brother at times during this meeting was thinking about forgiving the people who hurt you in your past. I never considered such a thing. There was no discussion of that in my training.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so enraptured by this, I thought, well, this makes sense. So instead of just expressing anger, which had been the major thrust of the mental health field, oh, if you're angry, let it out. Well, that's a terrible mistake, because people in marriage often have so much buried anger with their father, with their mother, and others, that when they let it out, they overreact.
Right.
So this concept of forgiveness made sense. It was appealing, and I then began to apply it in my clinical work. And from that, we have a couple textbooks with the American Psychological Association books. Now the most recent one, Forgiveness Therapy. So now
Mm-hmm.
it's then right now we have it's an approved system of psychotherapy in the young, and I mean young, mental health field.
When you graduated in 1976 from medical school and you began clinical practice as a psychologist, I'm not sure if you've done this kind of before-after snapshot, but could you say that the people in your first year were dealing with the same kinds of mental health issues as they were in the last year, like from today, the last 12 months?
This is a very good question. This is a very good question. So in the first book that we did, it was published in 2000 for the APA.
Mm-hmm.
In the section on marital anger in kids, I had very little on the issue of selfishness causing anger. 15 years later, major discussion of that. So it became clear that the nature of anger often comes from selfishness, but also, Patrick, just the explosion of selfishness in the culture caused by many things, including the contraceptive mentality. We're seeing a much higher prevalence of all psychiatric illnesses in adults and in children, often driven by this explosion of selfishness in the culture.
One of the guests I've learned a lot from in my time as a host is Dr. Judith Reeseman, who is the first to expose the criminal element and the wall-to-wall deception of Alfred Kinsey. And a guy by the name of Hugh Hefner met up with Kinsey and said that he wanted to be his pamphleteer, which is exactly what the Playboy Empire became, the pamphleteer of the lies that Kinsey told about homosexuality. And we later learn, and I have to credit Dr. Reeseman for unpacking all this, that Hugh Hefner's wife cheated on him during World War II. He was away and she was unfaithful. And it seems that the origins of the Playboy Empire are revenge porn. So here you have the marriage of revenge and anger, and it gets kind of eroticized with this notion of revenge porn. I just found that a very interesting insight, that you've got the let it all hang out when it comes to the sexual faculty in the form of lust, and let it all hang out when the emotional faculty in the form of anger. They seem to meet there.
No, I think you're very right. I think the whole thrust of a pagan culture is to focus on the expression of anger and passions, sexual passions, angry passions. Let your passions out. There's nothing empirically that proves that that's successful. In fact, we know from a Christian perspective, the goal is to grow in virtue, with the end result to become more Christ-like. It is not to just let your passions out. Babies do that. Mature men, mature women master their anger, master their selfishness, their tendency to control, their being emotionally distant in marriage and in relationships. And that's possible through growth in virtues, not from giving in to every passion you feel. Babies do that. Sure, adults don't do that.
How do you distinguish between anger as a morally neutral emotion and anger as a sinful response to a wound, real or imagined?
So when the Lord told Peter, forgive 7 times 70, here it is, he's telling the apostle with the hottest temper, cut off the servant's ear. He's someone who was really a very passionate man, very strong, opinionated man. But when he told him that 7 times 70, I think he gave us a very clear indication of the prevalence of anger. That is, that every one of us deals with stress, contradictions, difficulties in our daily life, and those often give rise to sadness and anger. So there's a normal response within us to hurts that are injustices that lead to anger. Now, the Christian perspective is to try to think about forgiving those who hurt you. This does not mean that times you do not express anger, but the basic thrust is to try to master your anger by forgiving, especially in marriage. When one gives into the expression of anger in marriage, you can really wound the spouse and wound children. You don't want to do that. Now, the sinful expression of anger is when you really seek revenge, or when you find pleasure in expressing anger. And there's no small amount of that in the culture, including in the rebellion against the teachings of Jesus Christ in the church through passive-aggressive anger. That is, Patrick, not supporting the true teaching of Jesus Christ about the sacraments, etc.
So if someone has hurt you and you feel in your bones, as it were, the injustice of it, that it was wrong, and the person not only is not sorry, but is likely to hurt you again, that can give rise to the legitimate expression of anger. I mean, our Lord gave us the emotions, right? I mean, because I can see someone, believe me, I've been in radio a long time. Someone right now is mishearing you, and they're saying that you believe that, say, beaten wives should be, just forgive. Hey, just like Jesus to Peter. Continue to be a welcome mat. You see what I'm saying?
No. It's important we want justice. I mean, pursuing forgiveness enables us to pursue justice. When you're overly angry, oftentimes you don't think clearly. So working at forgiving someone doesn't mean you trust them. Important distinction. You forgive someone if you harbor anger. If you hold on to anger, it's going to take a major toll on your physical health, on your cardiovascular status, on your blood pressure, on your GI system. It's not good to hold on to anger. And so if you can be understanding and forgiving, doesn't mean you don't you trust the person. When the anger diminishes, you're calmer to offer a correction. So in marriage, if a spouse is being overly controlling, is being emotionally distant, two of the major conflicts in married life, it's important to correct that spouse for those behaviors. Very few people do it, but it's important to do it. And to begin by forgiving them and try to understand why they do it. And so you can correct, forgiving and correcting can go hand in hand. Overreacting in anger and forgiving don't go hand in hand. We're not meant to overreact in anger. Anger is meant to be expressed in a refined, appropriate manner related to a certain hurt or disappointment in one's life.
In the beginning of the book, Habits for Healthy Marriage, you talk about the fact that husbands marry their wives' families and wives marry their husbands' families insofar as all the default habits, the unclarified expectations, the pattern that's laid down by either your wife's or the husband's family of origin. That's the default setting that people begin with, isn't it? And people never think about this.
Sure.
How does my fiance deal with her dad? Because that's going to be like a radio setting almost, sort of setting the mode of the marriage. Am I overplaying the card here?
Patrick, you're totally on the money. You're totally on the money. And this is not addressed.
Mm-hmm.
This is not addressed in pre-Cana programs. This is not addressed in the evaluation programs for priesthood and religious life. We've got to get with it. We've got to look at there are 4 secure attachment relationships.
Mm-hmm.
First, the mother. That's the most important. Second, the father. Third, the peers. The first 2 in particular are extremely important when you think about marriage, or if you're having stress in your marriage. Is there a possibility that a lovely young woman, but who had a difficult father or a father who left her, is going to have challenges trusting her husband? Absolutely, she's going to have problems trusting her husband, but she doesn't know it. Or if the man had a controlling mother, maybe her father was an alcoholic, is he going to have problems trusting his wife? Absolutely, he's going to. And they need to be warned about this. So this book is meant to bring self-knowledge to people, to look at psychological realities, and we can work on them. I mean, I joke with my wife, honey, gee, you're really fortunate. I married later. I've been working on my baggage for a long time. Pause. Rick, what about selfishness? Whoops. Okay.
Yeah. Topic change. Look at the time.
Okay.
Where's my beer? Just to really win her over, ask her where your beer is. Yeah. Well, that's all great. What if your wife or your husband doesn't recognize it, won't face the deficit of that resulted from their their childhood, their family of origins challenges? Because I've learned a great Latin phrase from Father Paul Chek. He said it in a retreat I went to with Catholic Answers, and it really stuck with me. I looked it up so I wouldn't mispronounce it. It's a Latin phrase, nemo dat quod non habet. Nemo dat quod non habet means you can't give what you don't have. So you have young couple getting married, and they're almost 2 empty glasses, and they're trying to fill each other, and they can't swing it. Perhaps one has more water than the other, but the one with the empty glass, because of a lack of affirmation from father and from mother,
right,
they won't even admit that there's a deficit. So what is the more affirmed spouse supposed to do? See what I'm getting at?
Okay. Here's what I suggest they do. Go to maritalhealing.com. Take off the homepage the parental survey. The parental survey is out of the book. Rate your spouse, your husband and your wife on that survey. That survey looks at the father relationship and the mother relationship, Pat, in each spouse. Rate them on whether they're forgiving, whether they're emotionally distant, whether they're controlling or not, and the degree of that. Print it out and then say, dear, could you please look at this? I really think that there may be some baggage. Look, we all have baggage. Here's the reality. One perfect family. All the rest of us bring into our marriages, into priesthood, into adult life, into religious life, wonderful gifts from our parents. Mm-hmm. However, we also bring in weaknesses. Now, they're not always weaknesses that can significantly interfere with the marriage, but given the divorce rate, often, very often, they are. And they are most often come from the father relationship. However, in the last 20 years, we've seen an explosion of selfishness in women who have given in to the psychological view of marriage. So 2 views of marriage. The Christian view of marriage, it's a mission. It's a mission to have children, to love your wife, to sacrifice yourself from her, to get you and your spouse and your children to heaven. Cultural view of marriage, it's about my happiness. It's about me. You have to make me happy. If you don't make me happy, then maybe I need to consider other options. So looking at selfishness before marriage is also extremely important, Pat. What
That
degree
is, yeah, go ahead.
is a person selfish? And we can in the book, there's a checklist, you can look at it. And if you're engaged and you see a person that you're engaged to has high levels of selfishness and, like you're saying, is not motivated to work on the selfishness, then I think it's important that the person pause for a minute and think, I think you better work on this.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're not going to work on this now, you're not going to work on it later when we're married, and then we're in big trouble.
I was fortunate to have a spiritual director in Toronto named Father John McGoey, M-C-G-O-E-Y. Father McGoey was a Scarborough Foreign missionary in China. He wrote beautifully about emotional maturity and so on, chastity. And Father McGoey, for many years in the Archdiocese of Toronto, ran the marriage preparation program there. And he told me that he felt that he was called by God to gently try and break up all the couples. Now, he wasn't trying to sabotage them. He wasn't trying to hurt them. He was trying to sort of kick the tires of what they think their marriage is. Because a lot of people, they got the ring, they got the date. They haven't really met the other spouses or the other fiance's cast of characters. And Father McGoey felt that it was better to end a relationship that had a lot of hidden reefs beneath the surface than, God forbid, the thing crash and burn after children come along. I always appreciated that, kind of front-loading all the conflicts so you can get them up on the table and you can see the truth of the person, for good or for ill, that you're intending to marry.
This is one of our major. He's a wonder. He was an inspired priest. Mm-hmm. He was an inspired priest, and our hope is that this book can be used in premarital programs to help couples identify some of the major weaknesses that can seriously harm marriage. And the major four: anger, selfishness, the tendency to control, and particularly men being emotionally distant. Those four are four of the major weaknesses. Mm-hmm. Virtues can help overcome them, but virtues only take you so far, and then grace is needed. So the Catholic Church, we have the sacraments.
Yeah, we have the sacraments. We have confession. We don't have to, cover things with psychobabble. You can just go into the garbage man called the priest. Give him your garbage, and he not only takes them away, he deletes them. This is like awesome. It's a great exchange. I don't know if what's that?
So I'm going to say so many men who are husbands who are emotionally distant. Look, here's another reality. 70% of divorces are initiated by women. The major goal of this book is to prevent divorce. That's the number one goal of this book. Prevent divorce. 70% of divorces initiated by women. Second fact, in marriages with low levels of conflict. Low levels of conflict. Not explosive anger. Low levels of conflict. What does that mean? It means that the woman is often very lonely. Or she was lonely in her background with her father, and her husband can't fill up the void from her childhood. Okay? So it's important to look at, to tell some of these people, like the men, I've told them, look, okay, repeat your father's good qualities. Ask St. Joseph to help you to give more to your wife than you saw your father give to your mother. It works.
It works because we have the Holy Spirit. We have the relationship with God the Father that He's established through His Son, Jesus Christ. And the Holy Spirit comes inside us. It's not just a teaching from outside. The God of the universe can dwell in us through baptism. We also have the salient model of St. Joseph. I want to give a plug to my friend Father Don Calloway's magnificent new book. I highly recommend it. Run, Don't Walk, and Get Consecration to St. Joseph. Best thing I've seen, and I've read a lot about St. Joseph. The strong silent type, St. Joseph, goes through Scripture not saying a word. He's all about action. He's doing. Otherwise, back to Nemo dat quod non habet, you can't give what you don't have. I mean, if someone's stumbling upon our conversation right now, they might go, my wife just cheated on me. I can't just snap my fingers and forgive her. So do you believe that forgiveness for certain kinds of offenses is humanly impossible without divine grace?
Totally impossible. Yes, human forgiveness in certain instances is impossible. But the good thing is that there are three ways to forgive. The Greeks, before the time of Christ, talked about forgiveness cognitively. Second, forgiveness from the heart. Jesus Christ says you have to forgive from the heart ultimately. That can be a long journey. Third type of forgiveness, on the cross. Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. or the sacrament of reconciliation. There are many people who cannot forgive. The children of divorce, one of the most traumatic aspects of my work is seeing the children of divorce and knowing full well, let me emphasize, that the marriages could have been healed. Most marriages can be healed. The reality is spouses do not work on marriages the way they should. They don't work on them. They don't look at themselves, look at their weaknesses they bring into the marriage. If they worked on them, we wouldn't have this plague that is upon us, Patrick. And so these young people, we work with them. Can you forgive your father or mother for leaving? Of course not. I can't forgive them. I hate them. All right. Could you think about giving your anger to God? Could you consider about going to confession? Yes, I could consider that. So the same thing with infidelity. But let me get back to infidelity for a moment. That the infidelity oftentimes can be caused in part by the spouse who is distant, the spouse who is upstairs on the computer doing homework, not downstairs with the other spouse, a spouse who is controlling, a spouse who is disrespectful. So there are other factors that can play a role in infidelity. Now, a leading cause is selfishness. The other spouse is not culpable at all, especially the infidelity that comes with pornography.
Mm-hmm. Is porn use identical to adultery in your mind?
Yes, completely identical. It's completely identical to adultery because it's using another person as a sexual object.
I can imagine someone hearing what you just said earlier about, the multiple factors that go into an act of adultery, saying, well, so he's saying, it's basically not my fault. My wife's a you-know-what, or my husband's a you-know-what. I'm not getting what I need, so I'm going to go to a different well and get filled up. But that's clearly not what you're saying.
No, it is not what I'm saying. Marital love is demanding. Marital love is demanding. And if we have a spouse who's emotionally distant, okay, or who's controlling, who's overly angry, it's very important. Try to look at the child inside that spouse. We were talking earlier. What was the background with the father like? What was the background with the mother like? When you look at that, you can often see a wounded child inside that spouse. You can be sensitive to that spouse, talk about healing of that spouse, or pray for that spouse. Mm-hmm. It took me a long time to understand this, but in marriage, the two are one. So when you pray for your spouse, the healing of her childhood, his child, it's exactly like they're praying for the healing of those wounds. Mm-hmm. It's a great sacrament, sacrament of marriage. It's a phenomenal sacrament.
Yeah, it helps out the union of two sinners, right? That's why we say, "So help me, God." I'm sure you're familiar with the what's the best way to put it? The theory or the thesis, that's the right word, of Dr. Paul Vitz in his book Faith of the Fatherless. That,
yes.
Of course, mothers are indispensable. I mean, we begin. I say this in my talk to Catholic men. We begin our life, our whole existence for 9 months is spent beneath the heart of a woman. And we're born and we're surrounded by women. They're ER nurses. Then there's junior kindergarten. Then there's Aunt M, and then there's elementary school. At some point, the father has to intervene, has to join that union of childhood with mother. And there has to be a kind of, this is my homespun theory here. Just stop me if I start going, off the rails or wrong. But the invisible umbilical cord between mother and child, especially with the little boy, has to be snipped. The father has to enter in. Because only fathers can endow masculinity. Even a supermom, and there's lots of them out there, they can't do it because you can't give what you don't have.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Makes all the sense in the world. The basic foundation that feels safe is the mother. She is critical, but the father's love is equally critical. It is particularly critical to boys, little babies. A number of women have told me that after they've had several daughters and they have a son, that they're shocked by the way this little boy wants to bound out of their arms to the father figure. He wants to go toward him because he knows how much he needs him. Men need to realize that. If more men realize how much their children need them, they would work harder at their marriage. They would not divorce their husbands. Same thing with women. If they realize how critical that marital union is for husband and wife, they would never in a million years traumatize their children, usually lifelong trauma, by divorcing their spouses.
I've noticed, I don't know if it's a trend or an uptick or a fad or what, but I've heard this a fair amount in the last couple of years, Rick, and that is when a woman decides to end the marriage, she's surrounded by other Catholic women who affirm her in that decision. Because it's, I don't know, you're finding your happiness, you're following your bliss. I'm sure that the reverse is true, that some men may receive affirmation from their Catholic brothers in Christ. But I've noticed this trend of women leaving, Mr. Wrong and being just love bombed by their Catholic women friends. Is this? Have you noticed this, or is this just something?
Oh yes,
in my circle.
They're oftentimes totally supported by the mental health field. So one has to be extremely careful in who one sees in marital therapy. In the book, I cited a study, 600 couples in Florida, Pat. 600 couples. Steve Knock, former great marital scholar at the University of Virginia, ran the study. Those who went to therapy, 2 to 3 times more divorce than those who did not go to therapy. Why would that be? Here's the reason for that most mental health professionals, they don't take the Catholic view of marriage. They take the psychological view of marriage. Oh, you're not happy. Oh, your husband is distant. Well, definitely you should get divorced. No, you shouldn't. You should talk to your husband about why he's emotionally distant, how he's acting like his father in that way. He doesn't have Asperger's disease. They label these men with Asperger's disease. He doesn't have Asperger's disease. He's a fellow, his love language is deeds. He's a good man. Like John Paul II would say, be loyal to the core goodness of your spouse, work on the weaknesses surrounding on the periphery of that goodness. You do that, most marriages can be healed. These Catholic women are making an enormous mistake, and they are wounding not only that couple, they are wounding the children of that couple.
The children are often the forgotten players. I mean, the Catholic Church's teaching on the purpose of marriage, this is Thomas Aquinas and other doctors of the Church, proles fides sacramentum. And the first one is marriage is ordained to procreate. If you can't perform the sexual act, you're not a candidate for the sacrament of matrimony. It's embedded in the name of the sacrament, matrimony, maternal, motherhood, right? And so since you're talking about the difference between the Catholic view of marriage and the secular, here's another one I've noticed, and it's almost a default understanding at the parish level, I would say, that the love of the mother for the kids and the love of the father for the kids function as almost separate silos, as opposed to the mother's and the father's love for each other, the husband's love for his wife, and vice versa, and that flowing out. So they have a united front. There's an unbreakable bond there that Junior can't play mom off dad because they're the same team. They really are one. I've just noticed this. It's a very secular understanding. Well, mommy says this and daddy says this. Well, are they separate galaxies or what?
Right. Right.
There's there's no implicit question there.
But it's a wonderful reflection. I mean, John Paul II would write that in many ways, marital love, this flow of love between a husband and a wife, in a certain sense, is an icon of the Trinity. The Father and the Son, the flow is constant, and in a manner of speaking, you can't really describe it. And then the Spirit, is there, but through this flow of love, the fruit of that flow of love of the Spirit. Same in married life, this meant to be this flow of love between a husband and a wife. That flow of love, the goodies, the blessings spill out onto the children. It makes them feel safe, happy. One parent is not enough. A mother is not enough. A father is not enough. Each has unique and special gifts, the male genius and the female genius that the children desperately need to be complete.
Why is it important for children to hear their moms or their dads say the words, "I'm sorry," to them? Because parents they can sin against their kids. They can provoke them, as St. Paul says not to, right?
All right. It's very important to, first to tell our children to hear that how much we love them and that they're children of God. And then when we times, especially perhaps the most common thing is say we're sorry about his parents, is time when we overreact in anger. We should not react in anger. We should, if we feel angry to our children, if we feel angry toward our spouses, we should first inwardly, and this is described in the first chapter of the book, we should inwardly think, do what the Lord told Peter. Inwardly think, forgive 7 times 70, meaning keep thinking, I want to forgive and understand, I want to forgive, And don't open one's mouth to correct a child or a spouse until that anger has subsided. Now, many of the viewers are going to think, that's impossible, what he's asking. No, it's not. It's not impossible. If you work at it, and if you take that anger to the sacrament of reconciliation, and here again, one of the problems, a mother or a father overreacting in anger in the home toward children or toward their spouses, because, Patrick, they saw that growing up. They're modeling after a father or a mother who did that. And the psychological view of the person is that you have the right to express your passions. Well, no, you don't have the right to express passions in a home, at a child. You will profoundly weaken that child's trust. You'll weaken marital trust also. So there are benefits to being honest about anger, but one would hope one would try to correct without the excessive expression of anger.
There's a Jewish neuropsychiatrist named Abraham Lowe, died in 1954. He was the founder of Recovery International. He's got some very interesting isms, and I find his anthropology to be kind of crypto-Catholic. One of the things he says is, when in temper, wear the mask. In other words, don't constantly let the external environment hit that third rail inside and always blowing off, always verbalizing it. There's nothing wrong. What did our grandmother say? Bite the bullet, zip the lip. There seems to be some clinical benefits from that.
So I would agree with that. But you know what a great challenge for the Catholic world today is? The level of hostility that is directed at us in the media and from certain sections within our own church who are loyal. It is very difficult to experience that hostility and not respond to it, Patrick. Okay, so we know what's the best response? Of course, the best response, we're called to pray for our enemies, to pray for those that are angry with us. But I think sometimes what's going on in the culture, we see many people, Patrick, now who are coming in because they're so anxious about what is the hostility in the culture toward the faith, and even the seeming hostility in certain aspects of the church toward the faith. And so it's important to ask God to protect us and to recognize that He will protect us, and we can trust Him even during very stormy times like these.
Following up on the Paul Witz thesis, if the father is absent or abusive, especially in terms of a young boy, there's a classic textbook predisposition, on the one hand, to homosexuality, and on the other hand, to atheism. Talk a little bit about how the manifestation of our cultural crisis of masculinity has worked itself out in seminarians and priests and even bishops. This kind of unresolved anger. Sometimes you can see it in fits and starts in the way decisions are made, the way some of our leaders communicate. Very passive aggressive, and sometimes, like you mentioned, forgiving someone who offends you or who's hostile. Sometimes that passive aggression will be, I call it being baptized, or holy water thrown on it, in the form of, I'll pray for you. It's like virtue trolling, using the very phrase, I'm praying for you, as a kind of, right? You see this in priests and bishops, this the prevalence of the father wound?
Well, so it's. I would say this. It's prevalent throughout all vocations. So, and it should be identified before entering. Okay, there should be a deep. This is not done. This is not done. There should be a thorough evaluation. Look at the 4 secure attachment relationships: mother, father, siblings, peers. Now, had that been done on Martin Luther, as Eric Erickson pointed out in his book, Young Man Luther, his father was physically abusive, his father was verbally abusive, his mother was verbally abusive. Had there been a profile of Martin Luther's background, it would have been, wait a minute, red light, hold it, wait a minute. Martin Luther, step aside. Now, that should also be applied today. If someone is pursuing priesthood, or marriage, okay, tell us about your father relationship. And if there was abuse, if he was an alcoholic, if he left your mother, if he was overly angry, you need to work on that. Now, you can work on that during the engagement period, or you can work on that in the formation period in this ongoing affective maturity program in seminaries, but it should be sufficiently addressed before you move toward marriage, before you move toward, say, being ordained a deacon. in the church.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But there is, I see with some of this massive rebellion against the teaching of Jesus Christ, I think of Martin Luther and Eric Erickson's book, and I've commented on this in an article I read in LifeSite News. Look, this is really not about clericalism. This is about significant psychological weaknesses in men who, oftentimes never played sports, never had male friends, and so because they've never had male friends in their adolescent period, they are attracted to males during that time of their life where they are profoundly sad. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And then narcissism. No adult male uses another male as a sexual object unless he's given into total and severe selfishness. So these two things, weakness in male confidence and selfishness, should be a critical part of screening for seminaries and in all the post-crisis programs. They're not.
Is there any cure for this kind of malignant narcissism when it's seen in a spouse or in oneself?
Here's a good question. I think here's the good news. I think a number of saints have been cured of it. Augustine. When he was younger, okay, heal me, Lord, but not yet. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
he would be tagged as a sex addict, wouldn't he?
Well,
Saint Jerome had that. Saint Jerome's always depicted with a stone, right? Always royally ticked off. So, Benedict Joseph Labre, probably mentally ill to some degree.
Well, so there was hope. We can, if we recognize it, we can really make an effort to fight against it. But Pope Benedict said it has an effect on us like the effect of gravity. I think one needs to fight against it every single day. Even I think it's appropriate in Catholic family life at Grace Before Meals to thank God for the food and thank Him for freeing us from selfishness, to fight against that powerful pull, because that's what gives rise then in marriage to the anger, to the control. These three powerful forces against marriage are oftentimes rooted in selfishness.
Another thing that you bring out in the book that we're talking, by the way, if you just joined us in this live hangout, our guest is Dr. Richard Fitzgibbons, the founder of Marital Healing Institute. MaritalHealing.com is the website. I know a lot of people have comments that there's not a lot of questions, but people are kind of bearing their souls about their struggles of infidelity and not being forgiven and not being able to forgive. So this is definitely hitting a nerve. It's called Habits for Healthy Marriage, a handbook for Catholic couples. So you're welcome to join us on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube. Rick, I was going to ask you about something you bring out in the book, and that is that women today, maybe this is purely because of the difference between men and women, but women tend to be more affirmed than men do, particularly by their fathers. Mothers tend to be more easily able to affirm their kids. Fathers tend to be less verbal in their affirmations, and that plays itself out in the union. Talk a little bit about the importance of fathers, not just providing well, not just writing checks, not just, having a roof over the head, but saying it. I know actions are important, and I know talk is cheap. On the other hand, talk is not worthless.
No, yeah, you're totally right. You've brought this up several times in this show, and it's extremely important. The role of father, very important for the men to look honestly at their own fathers. What is my father like? And because so many men come to us and will say to me, Doc, here I am, 35 years old. I'm repeating my father's temper. I made a commitment when I was 25 and got married, never to act like him. How did this happen? And I tell them, well, here's how it happened. A, you didn't think about forgiving your father. You were angry with your father. And two, you didn't ask the Lord, you didn't go to sacraments and grace and prayer, free me from that role model. Give me another role model. Or let me be loyal to my father's good qualities. But it is extremely important that men boys hear from their fathers, I love you. Extremely important. And that they feel his physical affection, that they feel his arm around them, pat on the back, and that he be present to them. And it's very important for fathers, in order for fathers to do that, for men to do that, before fathers were, in a certain sense, more loyal, they didn't divorce their wives. They weren't unfaithful like they are now. But today it's so important that fathers fight against selfishness, and that they be generous in their giving to their children. And also this, Pat, that they think about being generous in the number of children that they have.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, fathers have become terribly selfish, thinking, I want no more than 2 children. Well, where does this come from? Since when is a Catholic family meant to have only 2 children? So I think it's very important that men grow to be more giving and have resources, like you mentioned earlier, before we went on the air, an important book about fathers. Maybe you mentioned earlier in the show about St. Joseph. He is, I think, for this time, the time we are in now, he's an extraordinarily important saint to help Catholic men. We need it, and to help our priests too, because it seems like too many Catholic men who are married or priests and bishops are giving in to the culture. They seem too weak to fight against the culture. And that a lot of that weakness goes back to their childhood with their fathers. They were not strengthened enough and loved by their fathers. Now, St. Joseph can fill that void and make them stronger. We need strong leaders in the home, and we need strong leaders in the church who are not afraid to take on the culture and criticize the culture. And why criticize it? Why criticize it? We have a massive explosion of severe psychiatric illness in this culture, an epidemic of suicide in youth, in adults, in people post-divorce, men and women. 39% of adolescents reporting severe anxiety disorders. This is an extraordinary explosion of severe psychiatric illness, and a lot of it's because what is not happening in the family.
If you've just joined us, some folks are having a little problem with the stream. You can refresh and let us know if that's going to work a little bit better. Okay, yes, joined by Dr. Richard Fitzgibbons, 40 years with psychiatric clinical experience as a Catholic. A lot of clinicians that I don't know a whole lot, but from state to state, there's a great nervousness now to bring up the Catholic part of their therapeutic practice and their presuppositions because of the LGBT. The alphabet keeps changing every month. LBGT, there it is, agenda. And if someone comes to you with unwanted same-sex attractions, you better lawyer up because it might be illegal. And that's a huge obstacle for helping people.
Right, so in some states it is illegal. California, it's illegal. New Jersey, it's illegal. Yeah, that's going to be a real problem. That can be a real definite problem. But again, I think it's important for mental health professionals and health professionals to present the truth that children need a father and a mother, and that if a person has a weakness in his masculine identity, that masculine identity can be strengthened, and often when it's strengthened, same-sex attractions go away, or transgender attractions go away.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. How important is it for couples who maybe they've struggled, maybe there's been adultery, maybe there's low compatibility? Tell us about the importance of hanging out with healthy married couples and maybe a counselor. I mean, I keep saying no one in the history of the world has ever won a gold medal without a coach. The importance of modeling, especially when there's been a deficit of affirmation or a deficit of insecurity. And sometimes that, back to nemo dat quod non habet, sometimes what is lacking in a spouse can be found in a close-knit community where there's love and support and encouragement.
Oh, I agree with you. And sometimes the weakness in the father relationship can be filled by the preaching of the priest on Sundays at church. Mm-hmm. That there the man is strengthened by the fatherly role model, the image of Jesus Christ in the priest, strengthening the men to lead and to grow in virtues, to grow in grace. It's very, very important. I mean, our first recommendation for couples that are in trouble is try to find another couple who has a healthy marriage, who loves their marriage, who loves their children, who understands Catholic marriage. One of the problems is we don't hear enough about Catholic marriages. Mm-hmm. We don't hear enough about affirmation of Catholic marriages. And don't ever consider divorcing. Work on your marriage. There's grace in the sacramental bond. One rarely hears that, unfortunately. And we need that more often, because that will strengthen couples to know that most marital conflicts can be resolved with growing in virtues and growing in grace. Look, the resurrections occur. resurrections can occur in married life if a person really commits themselves to work on weaknesses. But one has to be cautious, very cautious about moving to see a mental health professional. I mean, we recommend going to the church's program, Retrovi. It's a great program to help couples. Look for other couples maybe who have good marriages, and only as a last resort might you consider screening a mental health professional. But one has to be certain that that mental health professional understands Catholic marriage. That's the foreword of our book by Archbishop Aquila is on just that topic, understanding Catholic marriage.
Mm-hmm. How many marriages have been destroyed by going to a therapist who himself was divorced? It's a kind of modeling that, well, this is why this is kind of one of my pet peeves. Let me get your take on this, Dr. Rick, and that is when people attack celibacy as unworkable, undesirable, it makes you unrelatable. I say that a celibate priest, if he has good, sound psychological training, is actually, all things being equal, a better candidate to help a married couple because he doesn't have any biases. He's just listening to both parties. And when you listen to enough both parties talk about the conflict, certain trends develop. Whereas if the therapist is, let's say it's a married clergyman who's been divorced or a married clergyman with a terrible marriage, he's going to project all of his own stuff into that conversation. Isn't that true?
It's totally true. A Roman Catholic priest who sees himself as a spouse to the church. His spouse is the church. He loves his spouse. Completely, he loves his spouse. And a spiritual father, that priest can be profoundly fulfilled in his total self-giving. His sexuality is surrendered to Jesus Christ and is being configured to Jesus Christ. And he is fulfilled in doing that, very fulfilled in doing that. He's an outstanding person, a priest who does that, to lead couples and to help couples. But one of the major problems we see in marital counselors is this. They totally support the psychological view of marriage. They totally support selfishness. They almost never, Patrick, ever say to someone, okay, you're thinking about divorcing. Have you considered that perhaps you've given into selfishness and that your selfishness is a reason why you're thinking of divorcing? Because we know from many popes have written that selfishness is the major enemy of marital love. Pope Benedict wrote, when faith diminishes, selfishness rises, and the heart grows cold. And that's totally true. The hearts are becoming colder and colder because of selfishness. And so these people, when they apply for annulments, red light, time out. Have you worked for 2 years on your psychological weakness? That's what they should hear. Have you worked for so that's the points I make in this book. If you're thinking divorce, you come to the church. The church should say to these people, tribunals, okay, what is your family baggage? I don't know. I don't have any family baggage. Come back when you find your family baggage and when you've worked for 2 years on your family baggage. Then come back to us.
If it can work for someone like Greg and Julie Alexander, whose double adultery was discovered in the same moment, I mean, that would be, that's a common done and dusted scenario. Almost no one would challenge their decision to get divorced. Of course, they didn't. They did stick it out. I think it was Ann Landers who said something like, yes, the grass is greener on the other side of the fence for about 2 feet, and then it becomes the same crappy brown as this side.
I'd like to say
yeah, what's that?
Right. One other study out of the University of Chicago, Linda Waite, big study on marriage. Their study of marriage and divorce, 3/4 of those applying for divorce, 3/4 were married to someone who was happily married. So who had the problem? Where was the problem? And the problem is often in the person who's applying for divorce. That person often has deep unresolved loneliness from their childhood, from their early life, mistrust, anger, selfishness, etc. Again, most of you, those listeners are thinking of divorce, please work on yourself. Look at yourself. Look at the last chapter of my book, or take the parental survey at barrelhealing.com. Look at your weaknesses that contribute to your thinking about divorcing your spouse and harming your children for the rest of their lives. Well, how does it harm them?
Yeah.
It undermines their basic ability to trust. Your ability to trust as a child is dependent on this flow of love between a husband and a wife. Now, that can be healed, but that is extraordinarily traumatic when that foundation is fractured.
Do you know Deacon Harold Burke Sivers?
No doubt.
He's called the Dynamic Deacon. He and I have shared the stage many times. I've interviewed him a bunch of times. He's been a Transform You expert for my members at coffinnation.com. He's from Barbados originally, Notre Dame grad, wonderful speaker. And he said something, just as a throwaway line, it really moved me. He said when couples, let's say in marriages where there are compatibility problems and they just quit and they divorce, those couples place on their children's shoulders the cross the Lord gave them.
Wow.
That really got me. It's an adult-sized cross put on the shoulders of kids, and how the adult world is so quick to say, "Oh, the kiddos will be fine. Good therapy." If I heard that once, I've heard it 1,000 times. The kiddos will be fine. Well, why don't you ask the kiddos, as Layla Miller did for her book Primal Loss? The answer is almost always the same. I wish my parents were together.
Right. I had an article published online at Homiletic and Pastoral Review the ending of this month on suicide prevention in youth. And a major factor, no question, a major factor in the explosion of suicide in youth is divorce trauma. The increase in suicide in adults, men and women who've been through divorce. It's one of the most traumatic things that can happen to a child. We need to be responsible adults and not engage in selfish behavior and lay these crosses on children. Most marital conflicts can be resolved if you work on it, and also if you bring back faith, if you pray about it. If you, okay, my husband is emotionally distant. My wife is a control maniac. All right, pray about these weaknesses in you're selfish. Pray about these weaknesses in your husband and in your wife, and you may be very surprised about the improvement over time that you'll see. Or gently, don't hold back correcting. One of the major problems I see, Pat, in marriage, people do not trust God enough with the marriage. And because they don't say to their husband or their wife, which they should say, honey, please try to be less selfish. Honey, please try to be more emotionally giving. Honey, please try to be less controlling. They should say these things to their spouses, gently, but in a supportive way.
The writer, Kurt Vonnegut Jr., said he wanted 2 words on his tombstone. He tried. I've always liked that.
That's great.
But isn't that great?
Right.
For couples that are in lopsided marriages, namely either the husband or the wife agrees 100% with Rick Fitzgibbons, has read all his books, this is their favorite book, they do say things like, honey, could you be less X or more Y? And darn it, the other spouse doesn't care, won't admit it, is fully dealing with metastasized narcissism, an utter blindness to one's own problems, one's own, being part of the problem. That can lead to a lot of sadness and loneliness. So talk about the supernatural virtue of hope, which is more than, Pollyanna wishful thinking. How can the supernatural virtue of hope help with sadness and loneliness in a spouse who is really trying?
Well, so this is a very challenging case you present, because the church, in her mercy, does provide for annulments in cases where one spouse is abusive and will not change. And I think that's just. I think that is appropriate and just. But
especially if they're, just to piggyback on that, because I know people will say, what? That just contradicts everything you just said. If there's mental illness that predates the marriage, if there's a deep-seated homosexuality that wasn't disclosed, drug addiction of some kind beforehand, there's a list of Diermond impediments that the church uses in her wisdom to help couples for whom there is no natural or supernatural way forward. Some marriages are putative marriages. They did their best, but they might qualify for a decree of nullity. But I would say if you compare the number of annulments that were issued in, say, the year 1971 or 1961 today, it's an utter tsunami.
It's a tsunami. This annulment process needs to be carefully reviewed. I've made a number of strong comments in my chapter on divorce prevention about that. Hopefully, this will happen in the future. Mm-hmm. We need much more psychological science brought into the annulment process, and again, identifying the weakness in each spouse, not only one, each spouse, and a commitment to work on that before they go forward with annulment.
Mm-hmm. There's one canon, I might be butchering it now. I think it's 1654, if memory serves. Someone could look it up. And it's a law of the church that requires bishops to meet with couples who are applying for a decree of nullity, so that before they separate, before they actually go their separate ways, the bishop is meant to sit down and talk to them. I don't know of any diocese where that is done routinely. It's still in the books, and I think it's a great idea. Maybe the sheer numbers would overwhelm the bishop's already glutted schedule. I don't know.
Right. I think that could be dealt with also, hopefully on a parish level, that the parish priest could screen the couple and mm-hmm. determine whether they have in fact really worked on it. My experience has been this, repeatedly, that the person who is applying for the annulment has not worked on his or her psychological conflicts. There are exceptions, especially when the spouse is a total narcissist, like you described earlier, and totally unwilling to work on problems. There, in justice, that spouse should be given a divorce. But the majority of cases, I believe, that can be healed. Issues can be uncovered. People are very surprised what they discover when they go on an inward journey, but the Holy Spirit enlightens them to the truth of their psychological background. So, Patrick, when someone applies for an annulment or criticizes their spouse completely about the marriage, why would it be that they wouldn't know their own baggage? Well, the reason is this, is with our intellect that we deny our emotional pain. So here, we deny here what happened. So the reality is we can have tremendous amounts of emotional pain and consciously not know it. But we go back in time and look at it and ask the Holy Spirit, reveal it to me, or do some examinations, then oftentimes what is buried will come out. Some people are afraid of it, that's why they won't admit it, mm-hmm. But if the spiritual component to the healing process, if one is made aware, look, all right, so maybe your mother was domineering because she lost her father when she was young, or maybe your father had an alcohol problem because his father had an alcohol problem. Well, if you really can have some compassion for those weaknesses, then and pray about them, they can usually be resolved.
I have a feeling, Dr. Fitzgibbons, that there's someone watching right now that regrets their divorce and wonders if they can go back. I heard a couple at a parish in California that I won't name. They had given a talk on retrovi to the parish. And they had been divorced and married other parties. And those second unions fell apart. Right. And they went back to their original priest. And they said, we'd like to get married again. And the priest grinned and said, I'm sorry, I can't help you. I can't perform the marriage. And they said, why not? He said, because you were never really divorced.
Amazing.
Beautiful. I mean, he's resting on the fundamental truth of that first union that was sacramental. You know, they can go to confession and so on, but you can't remarry when marriage is indissoluble through Christ our Lord, the divine bridegroom, who went through an awful lot of trouble to show us what the call of men is supposed to be. All the feminists don't like that line from Ephesians chapter 5 about submit to your husbands. Right. There should be more men. There should be an outcry. What? I have to love my wife as Christ loved the church? He was tortured for her. He was killed. Right. It's outrageous and impossible without grace, isn't it? Impossible.
Right. I want to I didn't fully answer a question you asked earlier about the virtue of hope.
Yeah.
So it's important to understand, okay, growing in my family background, where was my major weakness? And where did I have a problem not having enough affection and love? Was it the father or the mother? So when you discover perhaps one of them, maybe you wouldn't discover either one, but if you discover, say it's the father, you can our faith provides a spirituality that can help heal any wound. So if it's the father, you work on forgiving your father, and you work in spiritual direction, or you read the books you mentioned earlier about St. Joseph as a father. You grow in a sense of another father. If it's a mother, you work at forgiving your mother, and you work in a sense of Our Lady, going to Our Lady. Look what Our Lady did for St. John Paul II, whose mother died when he was a little boy. Extraordinary. He should have never done the things he should have never had the ability to feel safe and to trust without a mother to do the things he did. How did that happen? Our Lady. That's how it happened. She helped him feel safe and protected, and she can fill the void of not having comforting mother love, or a mother who walked out through divorce. We're very fortunate to have the Catholic faith that we have. It's a source of great hope and healing.
I was at a Catholic men's conference. I had a great time in Boise, Idaho last past weekend. 800 fired up Catholic men. One of the other speakers was Dr. Mario Enzler, who took a vow as a Swiss Guard to protect the life of John Paul II. Told wonderful anecdotes about this great man, whom I miss quite often. John Paul II gave my wife and I the Sposi Novelli, the newlywed blessing. Still have the pictures, 6 or 8 pictures, and I still pinch myself. And when I was in the presence of the Holy Father, it was 2001 in the spring. He was in decline, but he was still rather strong. He could still walk. He was the most masculine presence. He was like Aslan in white. Very hard to put into words. Confident, manly, even his hands, and this sounds a little odd, he had the most masculine hands. You see pictures of him lifting up the chalice. It was a beautiful thing because he was a strong masculine presence, but he was also very gentle. There was a tenderness to him that just didn't always translate on television. These blue eyes, and limpid ocean blue eyes that the camera never quite picked up. And I think you're so right about the Blessed Virgin Mary and the other men that he surrounded himself with. His father died, I think, when he was 21. So he had loss after loss after loss.
Right.
And he ended up being a man in full.
Indeed. Yeah, I have to say this, that I was so blessed that several years after I finished my training in psychiatry, he became the Pope. And his document, The Role of the Christian Family in the Modern World, was the first thing I read that helped me enormously. He has been a spiritual guide in my professional life, all my life. My book is dedicated to him. Every chapter begins with a quote from him. His work is cited in every chapter of my book because he has profound wisdom to help Catholic marriages and help Catholic families. I encourage the audience, read him. Read John Paul II. Love and Responsibility, Theology of the Body, Letter to Women, etc.
It's interesting and very providential that back in the 50s, when he was the Archbishop of Krakow, he was working out the antidote to the sexual revolution that hadn't happened yet. Look at 1968 and the fallout of the massive rejection of Humanae Vitae. And then he becomes Pope in 1978, exactly 10 years later. And then he gives these Wednesday audiences that really are the antidote. I mean, without contraception, the sexual revolution would never have gotten out of first gear. The idea of self-donation instead of taking from the other, it's a wonder to behold. His whole theology of the body as an answer to the chaos of the sexual revolution and sexual license.
Absolutely. In reading him, his works strengthened me tremendously, week in and week out in my career. I think he was for me a profound spiritual father and leader. Just profoundly grateful to him for his contribution, which is alive. Unfortunately, it's not. Attempts are being made to undermine it in some places, but you can't. People's arms are too short to box with God and to box with the profound wisdom of St. John Paul II.
Yeah, I've noticed a almost blackout in the church. We never hear about John Paul II much. We hear, silly things about the Cardinal Sarah, Benedict XVI emeritus book on celibacy. That's always going to be, a topic of controversy. But the man who for 20 plus years gave us the Catechism and the New Code of Canon Law and Veritatis Splendor and Familiaris Consortio, all the wonderful writings of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the role of laity, and it's almost radio silence on him now. It's sad. But we can do something about it because we are talking about it right now, and you amply bring him up in your book. So,
all right. Well, he plays a critical role in the healing of marriages.
There's a saying that's attributed to him, but me and my friend Jason Everett are on a race to find it, and we can't locate the actual quote, so it might not be from him, but it's something like this with respect to pornography. He's alleged to have said, the trouble with pornography is not that it shows too much, but that it shows too little. It's kind of a profound thing, right?
Profound.
So that's a long-winded way of getting you to comment a little bit about how pornography is lethal to the marital bond. That creates emotional midgets, and I'm sure that people who adjudicate decrees of nullity will see pornography as public enemy number one for marriage.
I would think so. Mm-hmm. Well, it basically is using another as a sexual object, and so it fosters, in marriage, is about the total gift of oneself, totally moving, as John Paul II would write in Love and Responsibility, moving from me to we. Pornography shrivels you up, shrivels up masculinity, shrivels up men and women, and then because they're shriveled up, they don't know how to relate, then they turn to marijuana, and then everything else, and it's creating a catastrophe in the culture. That and the marijuana issue, just huge problems. In the Catholic, I cite in the book, in 1969, in the Catholic Church, there were roughly 420,000 Catholic marriages. Mm-hmm. In 2016, 144. 420, 144. And pornography, marijuana, contraception, major enemy of marital love, cohabitation, a dangerous union of young people. Dangerous union, especially for young women.
I have a relationship with Covenant Eyes if people want to install what I have on every one of our devices here in the Coffin home, from laptop to tower CPU to smartphone, covenanteyes.com. You put my name, Patrick, you'll get 30 days to test drive this bad boy. Because if you were an alcoholic, then it's not advisable for you to hang out with problem drinkers. You should probably shift your locus of socialization away from the bar. Likewise, with pornography, it's half of the battle is access, right? If access is cut off and if there's accountability, then adults can live in it with adults, and there's a kind of a consequence, which is why I like the Covenant Eyes concept.
It's a great gift. It's a great gift to Catholic families. Great gift.
Here's a saying from Father McGoey. Try this on for size. And you can, as my friend Scott Hahn once told me, the good borrow, the great steal. He says marriage, or no, he meant marital love, but love is not a two-way street. It's two one-way streets.
Interesting.
Something to chew on. If you believe that love is a two-way street, which is the Hallmark card cliche, right, bromide about love, then when you do a good act for your husband or for your wife, you're kind of waiting for payback. Hey, where's my medal? Where's my cookie? I thought love was a two-way street. But if love's a two one-way street, because the wife pronounces her vows separately from the husband. So I'm talking to the men out there. If you lay down your life for your wife, you said that you will, and you remember the two verbs, I do and I will. Your feelings are not really mentioned in the vows that you took. So be the best husband you can be. Don't count up the good deeds that you're doing as though you're supposed to get some kind of gold medal. Your reward is rich in heaven. Yes. I just find that cliche, love is a two-way street, to be paradoxically damaging.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It makes all the sense in the world. It makes all the sense in the world. And I love your challenge to men during this show. And I think that the pull on men of selfishness is so powerful, and the lack of strong preaching about the sacrament of marriage, the lack of strong preaching in our churches, and the attempts to undermine marriage in Catholic schools and Catholic universities is not of a minor nature. All right, so these men need to be strengthened. I think men need this. Catholic men need today more than ever. I think the Eucharist, the sacraments regularly. I mean, I could never do my work unless I went to the Eucharist a number of times a week and holy hours twice a week. It's vital to be strengthened, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life within you. And we need, in this culture that is so troubled, we need that life that comes from the grace that sacraments can provide us and from prayer, of course.
One thinker I've learned a lot from is a guy called Jim Rohn, R-O-H-N, who famously said that you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great thought experiment. Like, who are my 5? And is Jesus Christ one of my 5? You know, if you hang out with him in the context of a holy hour, it rubs off on you. You are what you eat. You are who you hang out with. It's wordless. You don't have to have a PhD in theology to immediately grow in that friendship.
One of the things it does for people, it's very psychologically beneficial, is this, that there is an explosion of mistrust. So John Paul II wrote that the image of Jesus given to St. Faustina, Jesus, I trust in you, he considered the image of Christ for our times. And with the collapse of trust, with divorce, with infidelity, with a crisis in the church, severe damage to the trust, this prayer, focusing on the Lord, being transfigured to become another Christ, expands your heart, makes you more, takes the fear, takes the mistrust, takes the resentment of what's going on, and diminishes it and expands your heart to be more like his and to maintain that love and not to give in to fear, not to give in to excessive anger or self-defense.
And the grace that God gives is often it's not delivered with an emotional kick, but it is enough. I love that concept from St. Paul. My grace is enough, Jesus told him. Enough. It's a powerful word. Sufficient. Enough.
Right.
You know?
Right. It's enough to help men with all their financial fears. How am I going to provide? Some of these men who've retreated, Catholic men who've retreated from marriage, they're afraid of marriage. How am I going to provide for a wife and children and education? They don't think they can do it. But if they really trust God more, he will provide. The problem is there's a failure to recognize the importance of trusting the Lord with the sacrament of marriage. I mean, I really believe that we need a new evangelization for marriage. I think we desperately need, take John Paul II's writing, his writing in particular, as a basis for a new evangelization for marriage, to build up confidence and trust that God will provide your young man. Don't be afraid to move ahead into the sacrament of marriage. And I've treated many who are very afraid to move ahead into that sacrament.
Mm-hmm. Does that relate somewhat to the you can't give but you don't have maxim?
Right.
The fear that I'm gonna look inside and there's not going to be enough. I can't be the man that this woman deserves.
Right. I'm insecure. I'm insecure in my manhood. I feel insecure. I feel insecure as a husband. I think I'd feel insecure as a father. No, one of the chapters is on just that, the conflict of insecurity. That chapter is meant for men. It's meant for married men. It's meant for priests. It's meant for single men. Gratitude for one's gifts. The more grateful we are for the gifts God has given us, okay, the positive gifts we have from our fathers, and all of us have positive gifts from our fathers, and great gratitude for the gifts God has given us helps us move ahead and not be afraid to move ahead, to trust him with marriage, to trust him with the number of children he wants us to have, to trust him with providing for us financially.
Do you think that's why Scripture so often says this in various ways, be not afraid? And in October 1978, the first thing out of John Paul II's mouth, it became his brand, right? Be not afraid. Is the frequency with which this message comes across to us, do you think that's rooted in the fact that we are naturally prone to being afraid? Which is why we need to hear it over and over again.
Absolutely, Patrick. The most common psychological conflict is anxiety. Fully 1/3 of Americans will have some type of anxiety in their life. We have an explosion of psychiatric drugs today used for anxiety. I mean, psychiatric drugs, the major drugs were like way down on the list of prescribed medications in this country. Today, psychiatric drugs are either 3rd or 4th, and that's because of this extreme anxiety that people have. And faith, trusting in God. Like in marriage, if you trust that God is your father, he is your protector, that your anxiety about marriage diminishes. So it's important to try to think about trusting him with the marriage, with the children, with the house, with the finances, with the job. If you have that kind of a meditation, it's Christian meditation, and at the Harvard School of Public, I think it's Public Health, they have a human flourishing project up there, and they have documented in numerous important studies the enormous benefits of faith in psychological health, preventing depression, suicide in women, preventing all kinds of benefits. 5,000 adolescents who practice faith regularly. We need, Paul Vitz has written about this, there should be a recognition in the mental health field that virtues, theological virtues of faith, hope, and love have psychological benefits. It's empirically proven that they have psychological benefits.
And it has the added bonus of being true, which is always great. Well, Dr. Rick Fitzgibbons, I always learn a ton talking with you. I have a goon squad that I'm happy to send out to invite you back and be a mentor for our members at Coffin Nation. I'm glad to hang out with you today. I want to just throw as much traffic as I can at the book. Habits for a Healthy Marriage, a handbook for Catholic couples. I'll just put the title up there. MaritalHealing.com is the way to connect with Dr. Fitzgibbons. Find out lots more. Check out that parental form. Great mirror onto you and to your relationship, and I hope it's a blessing. CoffinNation.com if you want to join the largest culture restoring community in the world, now in 25 countries, CoffinNation.com. I want to thank Colin and Rai and Orad Tulu and Alana and all the people who joined us. The list is too many to mention. But thanks for being a gift, Dr. Fitzgibbons. I really appreciate your time.
Love to enjoy doing the show.
All right. Be a saint. What else is there?